All right. Hello, everyone. Just wanted to get started. Looks like we've got approaching critical mass at least, and it's just after 9:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome to the March Water Availability and Flood Task Force meeting. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sam Stein with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and just would like to ask everyone who's joining to put their name and affiliation in the chat, just so that we have a list of attendees for this meeting. I know we've got a fairly packed agenda today, so I was just going to run through a couple updates first and then turn it over. Just first, can everyone hear me all right? I know I've had a couple audio issues, so want to make sure that folks can hear me.
Sounds good.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Tracy. Okay, just wanted to give a couple quick announcements and updates. First, just wanted to say that on March 17th, Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack designated 23 Colorado counties as primary natural disaster areas due to recent drought. This type of secretarial disaster designation can be fast-tracked if counties suffer from a great drought intensity value as measured by the U.S. Drought Monitor during the growing season. D2, severe for 8 or more consecutive weeks, or D3 or D4 drought. The Consolidated Farm and Rural Development Act also allows for adjacent counties and state to be named as contiguous disaster counties as well. A secretarial disaster designation makes farm operators in primary and contiguous counties eligible to be considered for certain assistance from the Farm Service Agency, provided eligibility requirements are met. This assistance includes FSA emergency loans. Farmers in eligible counties have 8 months from the date of the secretarial disaster to declaration to apply for emergency loans. Local FSA offices can be provided affected farmers with further information, and I can go ahead and throw the link to those offices in the chat. And also just wanted to put up a quick slide here, just showing those areas. So just let me know if you guys aren't seeing it, but looks to be on the screen right now. So just wanted to also provide some sources for aid. So aid available. So the secretarial disaster designations makes farm operations in primary and contiguous counties eligible for the assistance. The assistance includes FSA emergency loans. I believe I already actually covered that. Sorry about that. I had that as double in my talking points, but also just wanted to click over here and show those designation areas for you. So I'll just keep that up throughout the slide because I didn't quite start them early enough. But just also wanted to give a plug for the CDA Agricultural Disaster Recovery webinar. And I believe that is on April 16th, I want to say. My apologies, I just don't have that right here in my notes, but I will pop that into the chat as well with the link. Also, just wanted to touch quickly on our Ag Emergency Drought Response Program. The Agricultural Emergency Response Program is available when a portion of Colorado has received emergency drought designation or a disaster emergency has been claimed due to drought. For those instances, up to $1 million is available for agricultural organizations for emergency drought-related water augmentation purposes. The grant guidelines can be found on the CWCB's website. The Agricultural Emergency Drought Response Program reimbursed for costs after the season. And for the 2022 irrigation season, the CWCB is extending the application deadline to May 1st, 2023. And the point of contact for that is going to be Nora Flynn on our side. Also, just wanted to make a quick note. This is more related to municipal, but the Urban Land Conservation Task Force announced by the governor is kind of getting set up right now. We don't have a ton to share on this right now, but just wanted to also put the press release in the chat. So as I kind of turn this over, I am going to I am going to put all of these links in the chat right now. And while I do that, just wanted to see if any water providers had any updates or if anybody else had updates. Also, just I know on the webinar, I think Kristen Boyson is on here. I didn't know if you wanted to also provide any additional talking points on that. And sorry for not having the date readily available.
No, thanks, Sam. I think you covered it. And I think Dan is on the line too, and he's leading it. But should be a good webinar with great speakers. So hope everyone can join.
Perfect.
It looks like a couple folks already put the link in the chat and the date. So thanks, Robert and Dan.
Oh, and looks like my audio is a little bit off. Are folks hearing me a little bit better now?
I was hearing you fine.
Okay.
Sorry, John, to hear that.
Yeah. Apologies for that. Well, hopefully we can get that sorted out. All right. Well, is there any other updates from anybody else? Any providers want to provide drought updates or anything of that sort? I know can have time later on, but just wanted to know we've got a packed agenda, so just wanted to keep things moving. If not, guess who's on from the Climate Center today? I'll turn it over to you.
That's me.
All right, thanks so much, Russ. Let me just give you permissions to present, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okie doke. Can you hear me? John, can you hear me? Everybody else, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
I hear you. I might just mention too, you can turn on the closed captioning on the bottom if you're having trouble hearing.
Cool. All right. And you see my slides okay?
Looks good.
Okie doke. All right. Well, we'll get off and running then with the with our usual climate update here. Now that we're close to the end of March, we'll start with kind of the summary that goes back through the end of February, because a lot of the data sets, only update at the end of the month. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to try and get rid of some stuff on the top of my screen here. Okay. So we'll kind of start with that. This is my backyard yesterday morning. We got a little bit more snow than anticipated. It was quite a big one for us in Fort Collins, but fairly localized as well. Close to 10 inches we woke up to yesterday morning. All right, so we'll go back to some of the stats that go through the end of February, and then we'll get to where we're at in March so far in just a little bit. So the map here shows the ranking of temperature for the water year through the end of February. So this is the first 5 months of the water year. And so where you see blues, it's the on the cold side of the spectrum, and where you see reds, it's on the warm side, and where you see white, it's kind of in the middle of the pack. And so you see across the state, it's been certainly by recent standards, it's been quite a cool water year so far, and that's continued into March, as we'll look at in a minute. So through the end of February, 45th coldest first 5 months of the water year, which was the coldest start to a water year since 2010. And you can see spots in Northeast Colorado, especially, where it was in a top 20 cold first 5 months of the water year. And you can kind of see November and February are the months that particularly have stood out as being cooler than normal, and then March will show up as cooler than normal as well. And then this is precipitation over the first 5 months. Again, through the end of February, you see very, very wet and snowy in Western Colorado, and especially the western tier of counties. You see some spots in Northwestern Colorado that are a record wet start to the water year, at least through the end of February. And a lot of the rest of Western Colorado is in the wetter than normal territory. most of eastern Colorado, northeast Colorado more in the near normal range, but you can see some pockets that have been wet. But then if you go into southeast Colorado, that's the one spot in the state that has continued to be pretty dry and where drought persists, and we'll look at that as we go as well. Statewide, though, 25th wettest through the end of February, start to the water year, and the wettest since 2019. And January especially was the wet month in here. February was closer to average. And then here's just another look at the February precipitation instead of as a rank, but as a percent of normal. And you can see pockets where the mountains that had been getting so much snow in December and January, it did slow down quite a bit in February, but then it's picked back up in March, as we'll see in a minute, especially like in the northern mountain areas. Parts of southern and southeastern Colorado did pretty well in February, although further down the Arkansas Valley, not as much. Northeastern Colorado was relatively dry in February, but that was after a record wet or record snowy January. So it's kind of where things stood as of the end of February, but now obviously we've got quite a bit more data as we are close to the end of March. And then here's the water year to date, again, through the end of February as a percent of normal. And you see those, conditions in Northwest Colorado and other parts of Western Colorado in the 200+% of normal range, also some pockets in Northeast Colorado in that range, but then some pockets in Southeast Colorado that are or have been very dry over the beginning of the water year. And so we can put this in the context of these quadrant charts that we like to show. So this is just for February, just the month of February. And so to orient you on here, basically the x-axis here is precipitation, the y-axis is temperature, and then it's divided up into these 4 quadrants. So if you're in the upper left, that's warm and dry, that's the drought quadrant. Cool and dry in the lower left, warm and wet in the upper right, cool and wet in the lower right. And then 2 different average temperatures are shown here. One, the sort of recent 30-year normal, and then the 20th century average, which is going to be a bit lower because that was a cooler time. As you can see, for February as a whole, it fell in the cooler than average quadrant and just a little bit drier than average statewide. And so you can see how that compares to all the other Februaries in the record for the state of Colorado. And so, yeah, ended up down here. And then if we do this for the water year through February, what we see is we're actually in the cool and wet quadrant, which has been not a common place to be in the last couple of decades. You can see 2019 right here, very close to where we're at in 2023 through the end of February. But a lot of other recent years like 2021 up here, 2017, 2018, much warmer. So it's been definitely a cool start to the water year, and that has continued into March up to this point. So just to kind of put this a little bit of climate and climate change background onto this, in terms of where this winter sits or how it compares with trends. This is a graph. So this is actually going to be, I'll show a couple of things here that are in the sort of draft phase of the climate change in Colorado report that our office is updating with support from CWCB. And so this is a heat map that shows the temperature trend or the temperature change since 1980. So the last 40+ years when the signal of climate change has become particularly strong. And these are different parts of the state sort of running from top to bottom down here with hopefully descriptive names, and then statewide is the bottom row here. And then these are all the months, and then you can see the temperature change in there. So what we see kind of there's a lot of interesting stuff on here that we could spend a lot more time on, but we won't today. But kind of the interesting thing that jumps out here is February, which has especially in eastern Colorado, has quite a strong cooling trend since 1980, just for that 1 month, which is in quite contrast to all of the rest of the year and months in the summer and the fall that have warmed very much, and certainly an average warming trend towards warming over this period. But February has been the month that's been different, and this February was no exception to that. It was another cool February. So it's kind of interesting to see, what's been happening with February is getting cooler, especially east of the divide, although it averages out to be cooling statewide as well. And that stands in contrast to January and March, which have warmed pretty substantially. So a little bit of background climate context there. And here's something similar, but in map form. So the left is the February for the full record, going back to 1895, and then for just that period since 1980. So you can see in the full record, if you go back to the late 1800s, February has warmed as well over most of the state in that period, especially in Western Colorado and Northeastern Colorado. But in this more recent period of the last 40 years or so, Eastern Colorado with a pretty substantial cooling trend. So I don't have a great explanation for why this is showing up in February, but it is something we've been seeing pretty year after year, because I think it was the 5th or 6th straight February that was cooler than average, which again is quite a contrast to all the other trends that we have. All right, so we're getting close to the end of March. Where does March stand so far? We don't have the full suite of maps and products, but we certainly have a pretty decent idea of what's happening. So this is temperature departure from average for the month of March so far. And basically everywhere in Colorado has been cooler than average in March. And so we'll see, March end up as a pretty substantially cooler than average month. This has been especially pronounced in northwestern Colorado. You can see parts of, up in the northwest corner of the state where it's, 9-12 degrees below average for the month of March so far, which is quite something. And this is a kind of an interesting stat that falls out of this. So this is for Rangeley, the cooperative observer station at Rangeley, and this is temperatures going back to the beginning of the calendar year with the average in this thick red line, and then this year in the black line. So every day since at least February 1st, the high temperature has been below normal at Rangeley, which is quite a streak. So almost 2 months straight. It might make it to the end. I haven't looked closely at the forecast, but I'm going to guess they'll probably make it to the end of the month with this streak continuing. There's a couple of missing days here. It's possible this streak goes all the way back to January 13th. There's a couple of days of missing data there, so we don't know for sure what happened there at the very end of January. But in any case, quite a very persistent cold over northwestern Colorado for this year so far. So northwestern Colorado too is a place where there's a strong connection between how much snow you have on the ground and how cold the daytime temperatures are. And so with all the snow they've had, that keeps the temperatures down during the day. And so it's been this really persistent cold there. And so having a cold March, I talked about how having a cold February is sort of in line with what we've seen recently, but a cold March that's not the case. So you can see if you look at March back to those same maps going back to 1895 or going back to 1980, strong warming trend over that whole time period. And so having a especially cold March like we're seeing this year is certainly a contrast from what we've been seeing in recent years. Here's precipitation for March, month to date through yesterday morning, with the drought monitor categories you can kind of maybe see on there as well. So it's been a huge month for the mountains, especially the San Juans, the Elk Range, Grand Mesa, all in through here, with another huge month for snow. This is our friend Billy Barr in Gothic, 8¼ inches of precip for the month so far. And you can see that lines up with the gridded map in the background with some, several spots with at least 8 inches of precip in those mountain ranges. So great for the snowpack. And I know Carl will tell us all about that. Eastern Plains, it's a little bit of a different story. Northeastern Colorado, really the storm yesterday and over the weekend has boosted the numbers up here a bit. It had been quite dry there. But you see parts of southeastern Colorado, parts of this part of the Arkansas Valley or along the Palmer Divide there with no precipitation so far in March and some pretty low numbers in the southeast as well. So, quite the contrasts around the state. And here's what that looks like as a percent of average through yesterday. So way above average on most of the western slope. You see these 200, 300% of average in many parts of western Colorado, and that's 300% of what's already a pretty big average. March is still a pretty snowy month on average in these places. So those are some very big numbers. But then you see the other pockets where no precipitation so far in March, or well below average on the eastern plains. So quite a divide across the continental divide there. And I won't go very much into snowpack because I know that's Carl's domain and he'll tell us all about it. But we sort of can't talk about the conditions and the drought conditions without at least touching on the snowpack a little bit. And this is just one graph to kind of show that. This is for the San Juan, the San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, San Juan basins in southwestern Colorado. The black line is this year, the average is this green down here, and just in comparison to a couple of other big years, the darker green here is 2019, which was our last really big snow year, and you can see that this year has blasted past the peak from 2019, which is quite notable in southwestern Colorado. And then the red one that then ends up following the blue up here is 1993, I should say, which has the record peak in that basin. And we're not, it wouldn't take more than a couple more storms to get above that. So this data only goes back to the late 80s somewhere. So I think, we know there were some even bigger snow years further back in history, but still it's quite a big number there. And, the fact that we've gone past 2019 is pretty notable as well, considering how much snow there was in that year. All right, so we'll take our loop around the state in terms of precipitation at some of these representative stations and see where things stand there. So we'll go counterclockwise around the state, starting at Grand Lake. And so I'll orient you to these graphs because we'll just look at these for a number of stations here. The long-term average is this gray dashed line. This water year so far is the black up to this point through a couple of days ago. And then there's some future quote unquote projections going forward based on past history. So all the little light gray lines here are all the years in the historical record from this date forward. The blue is a representative line along the 75th percentile going forward, sort of a year that would be the 75th percentile. The red would be the 25th percentile, so a dry year. And then the green is like if just average conditions from this point out went forward, where it would end up. So here's Grand Lake, which is just a little bit below average for the water year to date. And so you can see, the potential outcomes through the end of the water year could be just about anything as we get, we still have, April and May are pretty wet in this part of the state. And so you see, we could end up, very wet. We could end up dry, depending on how the rest of the spring and the summer goes. But most of the outcomes would be, probably close to average for the water year there. If we go over to Grand Junction, way above average for precipitation at this point. So 170% of the average to date, which is the third wettest water year to date at that station, behind only 2019 and then 1929, which had quite a bit more precip there. But it's, it's not a complete guarantee, but very, very likely that from this, that the water year will end up above average there. Only a sort of historic dry conditions from this point forward would put it below average for the water year. So that is good news at Grand Junction. We go down to Montrose. This data only updates monthly, but as of the end of February, they were well above average. So things looking quite good there. Down to Mesa Verde National Park, also way above average for the water year there. So 162% of average to this point. And they're only about 2.5 inches shy of the average for the entire water year. And the monsoon season tends to be pretty wet in that corner of the state. And so almost a certainty that the water year will end up above average at Mesa Verde. We go across to the San Luis Valley to Alamosa, and they're a bit below average for the water year, so 77% of average. But we know the summer is when the majority of the precipitation falls there. So really the outcome for the water year will depend mostly on what happens during that summer monsoon period, which if it's dry, it'll be a dry water year. If it's wet, it'll end up as a wet water year there. And a similar story at Pueblo. So Pueblo is actually, one of the spots in the state that's quite dry, eighth driest water year to date. Only 44% of average precip, but we can see there that again, the vast majority of the annual precipitation falls in the summer at Pueblo. So, a wet summer could easily make up for that, but obviously a dry summer would continue the drought conditions there. Walsh in southeast Colorado, similarly very dry in the southeast corner, so eighth driest water year to date there at Walsh as well. Even drier than it was at this point last year, which was quite dry. The good news last year was they had some good storms in the summer, big storm in August, but then since then there has not been very much precipitation. But again, similarly, the vast majority of the precip falls there in the summer, so a decent monsoon season could make up those deficits. But the most likely outcome is it'll end up as a below average water year because of the deficits that have been built up thus far of close to 3 inches of deficit already at this point. If we go up to Burlington, they are a little bit below average, although this does not include the precip that fell yesterday there. So they got some snow there yesterday. So this number could be a little bit higher once we include that. So a little bit below average, but not too bad. Again, the summer will be the big factor there, the spring and this upcoming spring and summer. So even with average conditions going forward, they would end very close to the average for the water year. Up to Akron, which is well above average, 158% of average at this point in the water year. So looking pretty good there. But again, the spring and summer will be key in what ends up happening there. But there's been snow on the ground in Northeast Colorado for a long time, a lot longer than usual through the winter, which is maybe not been pleasant. Joel can tell us about that, but certainly good for the soil moisture recharge. And then lastly, here's Boulder, which is a little bit below average for the water year, but not too much. And those deficits could easily be made up again in the spring and summertime there, or a dry period going forward could put it below average for the water year. All right, so we'll kind of try to tie this together then in terms of drought conditions. This map here I grabbed from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. You may have seen posted yesterday, just the difference in the snow depth from last year at this time and this year, quite a big difference there throughout the Colorado River Basin, which is good news and good to see. So here's the U.S. Drought Monitor map from last week for the nationwide. The worst drought now is the persisting dry conditions in western Kansas and extending down into Oklahoma and Texas. So this Southern Plains drought persists. Conditions, still some drought conditions in the west, but much better than they had been. So this is this year, and then here's last year at the same time. So just kind of flipping back and forth between those, we see that the conditions in the western US are way better now at this time than they were a year ago at this time. And certainly everyone's heard about the huge snows in California and Utah, Nevada, even in Oregon. So, just big improvements across the board in the West. And you can see in Colorado, we went from, drought covering most of the state to, a lot of the state being out of the drought categories on the drought monitor. And here's the zoom in for the state. Almost everything west of the divide is now outside of any categories on the drought monitor because of the big snow that we've had this winter, plus the pretty good monsoon in the mountains last summer. But different story east of the divide, where this mostly long-term drought conditions persist. The fall and winter has been pretty wet. or at least wetter than average. But big deficits were built up last summer and in previous years. And so that's kind of the long-term condition we're dealing with in Northeast Colorado. And then Southeast Colorado has been somewhat both short and longer term deficits. You can see some D3 and D4 persisting in the southeast corner of the state, as well as around Pueblo and surrounding areas in the Arkansas River Basin. And we'll try to kind of show that in a minute as well. Here's the change in the drought monitor since the start of the water year. So improvements across the areas that have had all the snow this winter, and improvements in Northeast Colorado, certainly because of the wetness in the fall and the winter and all the snow on the ground. And then degradations in Southeast Colorado, where the fall and winter have been quite dry. So yeah, just to kind of show a little bit of this contrast between the short and the long term. So this is the issue that we are always dealing with in terms of the U.S. Drought Monitor, which is trying to represent all types of drought in a single map, which is hard to do. So this is shorter term conditions. This is through the end of February. So this is the 3-month standardized precipitation index. So basically, where was it wetter or drier than average over the 3 months of the winter in this case? And mostly this is meant to focus on Northeast Colorado, where you see, basically near record wet conditions in the winter in quite a few places where there was a lot of snow. But also keep in mind that the average precipitation in the winter is not very much in Northeast Colorado. So it's a big percentage, on top of some places had, several 100% of average, but the average isn't very large. So we see that in the shorter term. But then if we go back, so this is 3 months shown here. Here's the same map for 12 months. And you see some spots that are, +2 or 3 in the SPI, which is near record wet conditions over the winter. But over the last year, they still show up in what would be a D3 drought category in the longer term. So it's hard to make up those deficits with winter snow because the amount of moisture just isn't that much, and they rely on the spring and summer rainfall up there. So this is and then if we go back to 4 years, then we see those big deficits show up over the last 4 years. So this is the kind of push and pull in the U.S. Drought Monitor that's always a challenge, because often short-term conditions look good and long-term conditions look bad, or vice versa, and you're sort of trying to represent all of that in a single map, which can be difficult. One quick map from, I'm guessing as we get further in the spring, we'll hear more about wildfire outlook, but this is the USDA Predictive Services map, which is clear across most of the West, basically indicating normal or average conditions for wildfire potential. This is for June. The maps look pretty similar for the other months as well, although below normal in Utah. And we'll see maybe when the new maps are issued at the beginning of April, after all the mountain snow, maybe they'll look a little bit different. Here's soil moisture. This is a little bit outdated now. This is like a week old, but you can see the biggest issues when it comes to soil moisture continue to be in southeastern Colorado, where those dry conditions have persisted, and then some pockets in the Northeast as well. Although with the snow over the last couple days, once that gets incorporated, that might make those conditions look quite a bit better there. All right, so let's take a look at the outlook. Which part of the mogul run are we going to end up in down at the bottom there? Shorter term forecast. So this is over the next 7 days from NOAA. And you can see some continued snow, especially in the northern mountains over the next week. Mostly dry on the plains, especially in southeast Colorado, although perhaps some precipitation in northeast Colorado, like on Friday. So that's kind of where that stands, and this is where that is with respect to average. So a drier than average week in the southern mountains, although not completely dry. And then continued above average snowfall in the northern mountains, and then mostly drier than average across the eastern plains and out into, further out east into the plains over the next 7 days. Here's the temperature plume map over the next 2 weeks. This is for Denver. Would obviously look a little different depending on other places you're looking. So the average temperature, we may not think of it right now, but the average temperature in Denver, the average high has reached 60. We haven't had very many 60-degree days recently. But by the weekend, we may have some 60-degree days in there. So kind of warming back up through the week, although chance for rain and snow on Friday. Nicer through the weekend, and then return to colder than average conditions again towards the end of next week is sort of what it looks like there. So kind of another cool down there. And that's what these maps reflect. This is the period from April 4th to 10th, which again puts the most of the West back in the below average temperature range. And then for precipitation, near normal, showing in southeast Colorado, a little bit of a tilt towards wetter than average for the rest of the state, but not a big tilt there in that period from roughly the first week of April. Kind of put this in climatological context, we might want to know what the precipitation typically is in April. And what this map shows is basically, is April a dry month or a wet month on average across the state? And so where you see the browns, it's generally a dry month. So a smaller proportion of the annual precipitation comes in April. But you can see for much of the Front Range into Northwest Colorado, in a lot of the lower elevations in Northwest Colorado, April is the wettest month of the year on average. And also for some of the mountain areas. And so you can see, along the Front Range, it's kind of a key month for precipitation. So, and also down in those drought-stricken areas, around Pueblo County and the Arkansas River Basin, April needs to come through to get those precipitation numbers up. So we will see how it plays out, but on average, this is where we tend to see that it is a key month for precipitation in a lot of parts of the state, although not as much as you get down into Southwest Colorado. All right, so kind of, I guess, the big news on the climate timescales is that La Nina is finally over. That was declared, I don't know, sometime in the last month or so from NOAA and others. So the La Nina event that's persisted for the last 3 years has ended. Neutral conditions will persist through the spring and early summer, and then what happens after that is kind of the big question mark. The odds are tilted a little bit towards El Nino actually returning by the summer and fall, but it could also remain in neutral conditions through the summer and fall as well. And just as a reminder of kind of how El Nino and La Nina connect to precipitation across the state. Basically, so this is the correlation between an index of El Nino, La Nina, so where so negative values are La Nina, positive values are El Nino, and so this is the correlation with precipitation. So if you see blue, it means that La Nina is wetter, and so you can see, like in the winter, La Nina actually favors more precipitation, kind of like we've seen this winter across the mountain areas. But then the rest of the months and kind of all the months in eastern Colorado, El Nino tends to be wetter. So I think in the bigger picture perspective, if we're returning towards an El Nino, that's probably a good sign for drought conditions on the eastern plains in the long run. But how that plays out, in the next few months is still pretty uncertain. And this just shows spring precipitation, kind of similar to the previous map, but just in terms of each year. So this is spring precipitation with respect to El Nino. So El Nino's so La Ninas are over here, El Nino's over here. Spring precipitation statewide. There's a positive correlation, but it's also not very strong. This connection is just not very strong. Probably the spring ENSO will fall somewhere close to 0. So it'll be in this range where you can kind of get anything from very wet to very dry. So it's just not it gives us a little bit of predictive signal, but not all that much. And that, I think, is reflected in the NOAA seasonal outlooks. So this is for April, May, June. I put a dot there at Springfield, and that corresponds to these pie charts on the left. So think of these again as a reflection of the confidence in the forecast. And so for the southeastern part of the state, there's some increased confidence in a warmer than normal April, May, June. But for most of the rest of the state, it's kind of equal chances of above or below or near normal. And then for precipitation, kind of similar, a slight tilt towards drier than average conditions in the southern half of the state, not much signal to the north, but this is not a high confidence forecast at all. You can see it only tilts the odds just a little bit, reduces the odds of above normal a little bit, increases the odds of below normal a little bit in southeast Colorado, but you could well end up in any of those categories. And I think this is partly because we're in this transition period out of La Nina, and it's not exactly sure how that's going to play out. All right, so just to wrap up then with a few takeaways, March will be our 5th month in a row that's cooler than average for Colorado, which again is a pretty big contrast from the recent trends and the big picture trends. And the snow has delivered in a big way, especially in the San Juans, in the mountains. In Western Colorado, you saw the drought monitor map, which is basically has nothing on it in almost all of Western Colorado. And I think the drought concerns, at least for now, in west of the divide within Colorado have largely faded, as I'm sure Carl will get into. The outlook for the stream flow and the reservoirs looks good for the spring with all the snow within Colorado to get back at least into a more normal operating range. But of course, there's still these huge issues downstream with Powell and Meade, and none of that is getting fixed in one big snow year. But at least within our reservoirs in Colorado, it's a good picture. Southeastern Colorado remains dry. March has mostly been dry in eastern Colorado, although there's a few exceptions to that. But in southeast Colorado, it has been quite dry. And so the drought conditions persist there. La Nina has ended. It will be neutral through the spring, maybe El Nino by summer or fall, but not totally clear. And that is kind of, I think, leaving the spring and summer outlook. I mean, these are always uncertain, but perhaps even more uncertain than usual. The summer outlook tends towards warmer than normal, which is mostly driven by the recent trend that summers have been warming quite a bit. And so there's the final slide with contact info. If you're not subscribed to our, get our emails, which is really, you get like 1 or 2 emails a month when we issue our monthly update and maybe something else going on. So please subscribe there. We have our monthly webinars, which is similar to what we just talked about here on the 2nd Tuesday of each month. And I will stop there and see if there's time for questions or anything along those lines.
Yeah, I think we've got a minute or two for questions if anyone has them. Any questions for Russ?
Russ, this is Kevin. How are you?
Hey, Kevin.
Great presentation as always. Thank you. We're always waiting with bated breath when we're at this meeting, but as you can imagine, this year I'm a little more concerned about things, and I would just like to ask you, in your position, when you throw everything into the stew, including where we're at right now, kind of what you would normally expect in spring, and then whether that's affected or not by this change in ENSO. Do you personally have any concerns about flooding in Western Colorado this year?
Yeah, so as you are clearly well familiar with, the rivers are probably going to be running high as we get into the spring, as the water melts out. As Nolan always says, our snowpack generally is well behaved in that we don't tend to get massive runoff, massive melt rates or anything like that, at such a rapid pace that it leads to big flooding. So probably at this point, 2019 is a pretty good analog, right? We avoided any big, fast warm-ups that stayed pretty cool through the spring. And if that can happen, then, we probably end up with fast moving rivers, but kind of minimal flood concerns. I think the biggest concern would be if we get a big hot spell in, relatively hot in like late April, early May, something like we got last year at that time, and the melt rates accelerate a lot and everything starts, coming in, running off at once, that's where the concern lies. But I think that's a situation that's maybe becoming more common in the warming climate, but still fairly unusual. So I think we can't ignore the, and certainly you aren't, we can't ignore the possibility that there could be some flooding. But, unlike California, for example, we tend not to have everything all melt all at once and lead to the huge risks. So yeah, I don't know. It's a wishy-washy answer, but it's, as I'm sure your mind, I'm guessing, is probably in the same place, is that it probably won't happen, but it's possible, and we should be, concerned about it, at least at some level.
Yeah, I would say my mind is in the same place, although I think that the southwestern area is an area of bigger concern for me than it typically is.
Yeah.
It's definitely higher than I can ever remember it at this time of
year. No, for sure. Right. And I think that, if we can avoid, 2 weeks of warm, dry, sunny, windy conditions, at some point in there, then that'll make the situation a lot better. But if we get, a relative heat wave or a really windy period, that's where probably the concerns will build up a little bit more.
Thanks for your thoughts on that, Russ.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions for Russ?
Feel free to put stuff in the chat too, so we can keep on schedule if there's other questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Russ. Really appreciate your presentation today. With that, I think we'll turn it over to Carl with NRCS.
Right. Thank you. And thanks, Russ, for setting the stage here. Definitely been a very, very interesting month with some pretty incredible snow accumulations throughout quite a bit of the state, as a lot of Russ's discussion and images pointed out. Certainly Southwest Colorado has been hit the hardest. But yeah, I'll just follow up real quick on that last little bit of conversation. I definitely agree with Russ, from a flood standpoint, that future weather component is really, really big. I think there's few things to consider there. Definitely agree with, hot, dry, and windy, as we saw last year, can definitely accelerate snowmelt rates pretty dramatically. We saw that last year with actually record-breaking snowmelt rates in a lot of the southern San Juans. One thing that should hopefully ease a little concern that is different from last year is last year there was a really high amount of dust on snow, or dust in the snowpack, that as it melts ends up on the surface and can gather more of the sun's energy. This year, from what I understand, there actually is pretty minimal dust in the snowpack in the San Juans and really across the state. So as it starts to melt, that is something that will be different from last year, but definitely with the amount of snow we've got in Southwest Colorado, it is something to really keep a very close eye on going forward. And yeah, a lot of ins and outs. I think Russ touched base on most of them, but the fact that there isn't significant amounts of dust in the snowpack is one thing that will hopefully help moderate some of those snowmelt rates. But within that, I will just dive on in. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, we'll just kind of go around our major basins per usual and then do a bit of a statewide wrap up. So up in Northwest Colorado, the Yampa White Little Snake basins currently have 146% of normal snowpack, 129% over in the combined Laramie and North Platte basins. Not a ton of variability really north to south within these major basins, relatively consistent compared to what we're seeing in some of the mountains further to the east. Here, looking at our time series graph, getting very, very close to record highs. Naturally, you can see we had some bigger accumulations in other years later on, but well within the 90th percentile range. So just a quick reminder with all these graphs, the different shadings represent percentiles. So anything in the purple is going to be above the 90th percentile. So compared to the period of record, definitely a very, very significant snowpack up in Northwest Colorado. Bit less, again, over in the Laramie and North Platte basins. You'll also notice peak snowpack accumulation does usually occur a bit later over here than in the Yampa White. So definitely in all these basins, time will tell how long our snowpack accumulation season does continue before we really start a net melt out. But already sitting at above normal values by quite a bit with potential to keep accumulating for quite some time, several weeks potentially. For precipitation, I tried to cater a number of things this month a little differently than usual. I have, for all the major basins, I'll have these graphics of March precipitation, and I'll tell you why. I'm not including our usual water year time series graph because with some slightly normal temperatures, but largely just the heavy accumulations we've seen, a lot of our precipitation gauges have been plugged. So we're hoping with some warmer temperatures that snow will drop in and register. So I put in these plots from the end of last week after we'd done our edits, kind of seemed to capture the most accurate representation of precipitation, whereas our current time series graphs, if you're looking at those, you will notice a drop off over the last several days, and that is just an artifact of plugged gauges. Missing some reservoir storage in the Yampa White. Currently, Yamcolo is holding 80% of normal reservoir storage. Going into our stream flow forecasts, just kind of bounce around to some of the major points. Both the White at Meeker and Yampa Maybell pretty similar, just below 150% of normal seasonal volumes forecasted. Coming down from Wyoming, the Snake River at Lily is forecasted for 200%. And then that's going to confluence with the Yampa right before it goes into Dinosaur National Monument. So the other thing I switched up this month, given the pretty exceptional snowpack accumulations we saw since our official forecasts were issued on March 1st, is these guidance forecasts. And these can kind of provide just an estimate of how those volumetric forecasts may change throughout the month. So you can see the lines on these charts are daily automated forecasts just from SNOTEL. And then the yellow squares are our monthly official forecasts that'll be using a slightly different model. A big difference is they'll also include manual snow course data. So that's why these won't line up. But in months like this, where we really see some big accumulations, these are kind of useful to get an idea of how things might have changed. So you can see since the beginning of the month, some increases in the, or likely increases in the forecast, nothing too dramatic. Going down into the Colorado River Basin, snowpack is currently 134% of normal. Really quite a bit of variability in where that's accumulated. You can kind of see along the southern divide here, has the most plentiful snowpacks. Then kind of up closer to the Yampa and White, and kind of along the Continental Divide, definitely quite a bit less snowpack, particularly in this area surrounding the headwaters of the main stem South Platte. Looking at our time series, currently right at about the 90th percentile, which puts it at 118% of the median peak. Again, with several weeks before our normal peak accumulation date would occur. For month-to-date precip, again, we'll see this all across Western Colorado and particularly once we get into the Gunnison and Southwest basins, but definitely very, very significant precipitation accumulations over the last 4 weeks or so. More so in the southern portion of the basin here, you can see some pretty impressive numbers coming out of the Elk Mountains, as well as the Grand Mesa. Looking at reservoir storage, a bit of variability. Looks like Green Mountain and Lake Granby are holding above normal values. A lot of the other major basins are below, including Dillon, which is just a little bit below, not sitting too terrible going into this snowmelt runoff season. And our long-term time series, encouraging to see over the last year and a half or so, close to 2 years now, I guess, pretty steady increases back up to near normal values in the upper Colorado. So going into our volumetric stream flow forecasts, most of these are going to be presented for the April through July period per normal. Just a quick tour of some of our major ones. Our main basin outlet forecast here, the Colorado at Cameo, is for 108% of normal volumes. Roaring Fork is on the high end within the basin at 114%. For the most part, not a ton of variability, particularly compared to some other basins we'll see. As always, and particularly with respect to this being a joint meeting with the flood task force, this Willow Creek stream flow runoff will be an interesting one to watch after the East Troublesome fire. Last year, we observed significantly higher runoff volumes in that area compared to other surrounding areas. And it looks like it is forecast for a bit higher. I can't see the label here. But that one and any other new major burn scars will definitely be ones to keep a close eye on when it comes to flood risk. Going to our guidance forecasts, can definitely see the impact of some of this March precipitation, certainly bumping up our anticipated forecasts quite a bit from the beginning of the month, but certainly substantially less than we'll see in other areas. Moving over into the South Platte. The South Platte and the Arkansas definitely have an interesting snowpack situation. That's why for both of these, for the snowpack map, I did decide to display it as subbasins instead of lumped together. As you can see, a pretty strong south to north trend here, with quite a bit less here in the upper South Platte. You can think of this surrounding the South Park area, and then kind of progressively increasing as you move further north, kind of with a hot spot here in the St. Vrain. I believe this one 476% is a lower elevation snow tell. I'm pretty sure that's Copeland Lake in Rocky Mountain National Park, is why that number's so elevated, because it would commonly not have quite as much snow. Looking at the graph, currently 108% of normal across the whole basin. Also note that the South Platte along the Continental Divide there does have a later peak snowpack accumulation date than most, if not all, other basins in the state. So quite a bit more time, close to a whole nother month of what would be a common snowpack accumulation season. So still much can change. So the month-to-date precipitation, some of the lesser amounts, a lot of the precipitation coming from the west seems to have been kind of wrung out by the time it hit the Continental Divide here. And kind of interesting to note, you really can tell the effect of the Continental Divide itself with a lot of these sites just on the west side, holding quite a bit higher percent of normal snowpack than some relatively close just on the east side of the divide. Or excuse me, in the accumulated precipitation for over the last month, not necessarily the snowpack. Going into reservoir storage, Quite a bit of variability here. Naturally, folks are going to want to dive into their particular reservoir of interest when analyzing how this is really going to impact their season. Looking at the long term, a bit of an opposite trend since things peaked last in 2019 compared to some other areas. More or less a steady decline in reservoir storage with a bit of an uptick. But again, this time of year, lots going to change with reservoir storage over the next 4 months or so. Looking at our stream flow forecasts, per usual, these general trends are going to follow the snowpack and water year precipitation. Definitely some relatively low forecasts here on the main stem South Platte. 75% of normal here at the gauge we call South Platte at South Platte, kind of before it spills out into the plains, and then kind of progressively increasing as you go further north. Looking at our guidance forecasts, with that month-to-date precipitation map that we just saw, not a big surprise that we haven't really seen substantial changes in the projected forecast volumes. But again, this is also bearing in mind that these are just considered guidance, and we will have our official monthly forecast coming out hopefully within the next week or so, or a little over a week. So going back to Western Colorado in the Gunnison, next few basins is where we're really going to see the impact of this significant storm system throughout the month of March. Basin-wide snowpacks at 165% of normal. Fair amount of variability site to site. Definitely see, as Russ touched on, quite a bit of snow on the Grand Mesa, in the Elk Mountains there. Little bit less so in the northern San Juans and kind of eastern portions of the basin, but still a rather plentiful snowpack. Another one to note here, our lone site up on the Uncompahgre Plateau, I believe has blown away its previous record. Currently 288% of normal snowpack up on the plateau. Here, looking at our time series, we can see sitting just barely below a record high snowpack across the Gunnison for right now. Some other years had some late storms come in, so quite a bit of accumulation would have to start to keep up with that, but very, very significant snowpack. Looking at our month-to-date precipitation here, again, really, really incredible numbers. I've got a map at the very end showing which of these were records or near record accumulations. But yeah, definitely you can see the San Juans caught the brunt of this storm, but nothing to sneeze at across really much of the areas surrounding the Gunnison Basin. Reservoir storage is the Gunnison and the combined Southwest basins are currently holding the lowest percent of normal reservoir storages in the state. But again, they also have some of the more plentiful snowpacks, so encouraging there. Again, always got to point out Blue Mesa, our largest in the state, which is probably at about 55% of normal storage. So still holding quite low in Blue Mesa, but hopefully we'll get some replenishment this year. We're going to see that quite clearly on our time series. These are going back to 1990, where we had this big boost in 2019, and then the last several years kind of dropping and holding at some of the lower values we've really seen over the last 30 years or so. And onto the stream flow forecasts, really quite a bit of variability. So naturally, you're going to want to really pay attention to the specific forecasts that are of interest to you, as opposed to necessarily the basin-wide number. Really, really plentiful forecasts coming out of the North Fork of the Gunnison here, with some of that snow from the Elk Mountain region, as well as coming off of the Grand Mesa. Little bit less coming out of the northern San Juans. Pretty good coming out of the main stem headwaters up here, around 130% of normal at Gunnison. So here's where we really start to see some of the value in these guidance forecasts to really see how much these monthly precipitation values can change the projected volumetric forecasts. Really significant increases with a lot of this March precipitation, and largely even just over the last 2 weeks or so. So certainly if you're in the Gunnison or interested in those forecasts, certainly keep your eyes open for an update coming with our next monthly official forecasts. On into Southwest Colorado. So the combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan has recently reached an all-time record snowpack. Quite impressive there, 183% of normal. Lot of variability there. A lot of this is driven by above normal low elevation snowpacks in general. Like this is our Cascade #2 site, kind of near Purgatory Ski Resort, is the highest, but really phenomenal snowpack down in Southwest Colorado. These time series graphs accentuate that quite nicely, since kind of the middle of February or so, a pretty meteoric rise, nearly doubled the snowpack to its current record values that we're seeing. And I had to point out the Dolores in particular as having the most plentiful. As you can see, even with a little bit more time to go, and the normal snowpack accumulation season has already well exceeded the all-time observed peak. So certainly anticipate pretty plentiful streamflow runoff in the Dolores. Here's our month-to-date precip map showing that basin-wide, 368% of normal precipitation accumulation as of the end of last week. Some of the hot spots, certainly really the further south in the basin or further south in the mountainous regions that you see are the most plentiful, going from Wolf Creek Pass all the way over to the Southwest San Juans, consistently over 400% of normal monthly precipitation. Similar to the Gunnison, reservoir storage is on the low end, but I'm not going to dwell on this too much, as we are certainly anticipating some major changes in this over the coming months. We can see here since 2019, really over the last several years have struggled with low streamflow volumes, have struggled to gain back much of that net storage. So hoping to see some significant recovery this year. Into the forecasts themselves, some of the highest ones, McPhee Reservoir inflow on the Dolores at 151% of normal. From what I recall, that reservoir was quite low, so that'll be encouraging news for those folks. Animas at Durango, 127%. Definitely encouraging, but again, that was nearly a month ago and a lot has changed. So you can really see the most dramatic effect on these guidance forecasts with significant increases seen over the last month. So certainly anticipate those April 1st forecasts to be quite a bit different than a month ago. Over into the Rio Grande, currently has 139% of normal snowpack. Looking at individual stations here, you can really see a huge difference in snowpack depending on where in the basin you're looking, with the eastern San Juans being rather plentiful as compared to the Sangre de Cristos, which throughout the entire water year have held some of the lower snowpacks in the state relative to normal. Going on to our graph, can definitely see huge improvement in the snowpack over this last month though. And yeah, nearing the normal peak time, but again, that's not always set in snow. That can vary easily. Several weeks either way is quite common. But huge increase. That looks to be in the range of about 5 inches of SWE, which would be more than a third of normal total snowpack that we just got in the last several weeks. Month to date precipitation, very encouraging to see that a lot of this moisture did finally make it over to the Sangre de Cristos, not necessarily every station, but good to see some more accumulation over there, as well as the eastern San Juans, as well as some of the more northerly parts of the basin. Getting back into some better reservoir storages, we can see not nearly as much fluctuation over the last 3 to 4 years as we've seen in other basins. Been maintaining relatively a bit below normal for a couple of years, and then just this year bopped back above normal storage values in the Rio Grande. Stream flow forecasts here, quite a bit of variability, but definitely substantially less than neighbors to the west. Rio Grande del Norte was forecast for 106% of normal. That's always an important one to keep an eye on for the Rio Grande compact and trying to plan that out. Saguache Creek is on the lower end, as well as Ute Creek in the mid 80s as far as percent of normal is concerned. But again, that said, definitely anticipating some increases in those forecasts for our April 1st official round. Over into the Arkansas, the final major basin we'll take a look at. In the Arkansas, I did also opt to display our snowpack on a sub-basin perspective as well. You can see the headwaters here are faring, and basically think about this as the Arkansas above Salida. We've got Salida right here, faring substantially better than some of the lower tributaries. Definitely some boosts over the last month, which is really encouraging to see, but certainly a stark difference compared to the main stem headwaters versus a lot of these southern tributaries. Here we can see basin-wide still holding slightly below normal, but very close to at 97% of normal snowpack, thanks to these significant increases over the last several weeks. Looking at month-to-date precip, you can see, I'll just jump back here, where this dramatic increase came from, basin-wide at 186% of normal. And again, encouraging to see that a lot of these stations in the Sangre de Cristos did finally receive some of that precipitation that had been missing for much of the water year to date. Reservoir storage sitting generally near normal across basin wide, at least as compared to the Gunnison and Southwest basins. Been holding at these below normal levels, similar to the Rio Grande, not a ton of up and down throughout the snowmelt seasons and not a ton of big drops. So sitting below normal, but not extremely so. So on to our stream flow forecasts. Again, you can really see some of these north to south differences, bearing in mind that particularly I'm anticipating notable increase in the forecasts for some of these southern tributaries. But Arkansas at Salida currently forecast for 102% of normal, and as of the first of the month, down as low as around 60% of normal for some of these southern tributaries. But certainly keep your eyes peeled for an update here in the coming week and a half or so. So here's just one example. Arkansas at Salida is one I chose, but again, quite a bit of spatial variability in these forecasts. But you certainly can see for this forecast, anticipating an increase in our official forecasts as well for April 1st. So finally, down to our kind of statewide summary per usual. Currently 141% of median snowpack, strongly favoring the basins of Southwest Colorado, with the South Platte and the Arkansas, both holding the least relative to normal. And again, bear in mind that quite a bit of variability within these basins, with the Arkansas headwaters holding quite a bit more snow, as well as the Northern Front Range holding more snow than other portions of the basin. And then kind of in the middle of the pack, we've got Yampa White, Laramie North Platte, Colorado headwaters, and the Upper Rio Grande. Almost paling in comparison to some of these other ones, but still very, very significant snowpacks. Here, looking at our time series graph, well above the 90th percentile of statewide snowpack there. Very, very encouraging to see from a water supply standpoint, but very pertinent year to be holding this meeting with the flood side of things, because also certainly some significant concerns depending on how melt rates and some other factors pan out there. So this is a map of, we call them our delta values if you're using our interactive map, but basically this is the change in snow water equivalent over the last month. And the colored dots on here are showing sites that either had a record increase in snow water equivalent or were the second highest. So the darker blue was an all-time record March increase in snow water equivalent. The lighter blue is the second highest. I didn't actually do the count, but you can definitely tell across really all of Western Colorado, quite an impressive number of sites did receive all-time record SWE accumulations. Here's our total water year-to-date precipitation. Very similar trends to the snowpack as you would anticipate. The percent of normal values are consistently a bit lower, largely due to the majority of October was rather dry, but overall a relatively similar trend to snowpack per usual. Here's our month-to-date precipitation statewide look. Again, really almost astounding numbers down here in Southwest Colorado, 368% of normal, kind of the least in the South Platte, but really impressive monthly accumulations overall. So on to our reservoir storage. Again, it's been kind of the same story throughout the winter with the Gunnison and combined Southwest basins residing very much on the low end, but also very encouraging that they have by far the most plentiful stream flow forecasts coming their way. So anticipating quite a bit to change with reservoir storage over the coming months. Going to our time series here. And again, what we're looking at here is a departure from median from a volumetric standpoint, as opposed to percent of normal. So you can see this darkest blue line is our total statewide reservoir storage deficit. And then you can kind of also see the proportions of what basins that's coming from, with the largest proportion of that deficit being from the combined Southwest basins, followed by the Gunnison, with a lot of the other major basins volumetrically remaining relatively near normal. Stream flow forecasts. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, and rather just recommend everyone keep an eye out for our upcoming water supply outlook report, anticipating a lot of these to change quite a bit. So just to wrap it up, yeah, really incredible monthly precipitation values, particularly in Southwest Colorado. I'm thinking especially back to that map showing record SWE accumulations over the past month. Currently, all major basins holding above normal snowpack except the Arkansas, which is up to just slightly below basin wide, but with both the Arkansas and South Platte, certainly pay attention to the sub-basin scale, as well as individual stream flow forecasts, because quite a bit of variability there. I'll kind of buzz over the stream flow forecasts. I'm hoping some of those time series plots of our guidance forecasts will give you a good idea of how things are anticipated to change. But certainly looking at the most plentiful stream flow forecasts or stream flow volumes than we've seen for the last several years since 2019. So probably encouraging people who will want every drop of water, and probably concerning for folks who are more invested in the flood risk side of things. So just definitely a year to keep a close eye on changing conditions and how snow melt rates end up panning out. Reservoir storage, relatively across the state hasn't changed a ton, but again, anticipating some really big changes in how those percent of normal and volumetric reservoir storages change as we go through the remainder of snowmelt runoff season. That is all I have. If anyone has any questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Carl. Any questions for Carl?
Carl, hey, this is Kevin again. Great presentation. Thanks for all the graphs and maps that you show. I got a couple things I want to ask you about. First of all, I'm wondering if you can comment on the soil moisture heading into the winter and how that may or may not have affected your runoff totals.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's been a very relevant topic for the last several years, where particularly in Western Colorado, we had especially hot and dry summers that really depleted soil moisture, and we were seeing observed stream flow runoffs significantly below what would be common with a given snowpack. But with last year's very plentiful monsoon season, we did enter, I don't know off the top of my head exactly where we sat basin by basin, but much closer to normal soil moisture volumes, which we're certainly hoping will help improve stream flow forecast skill, because that's definitely a challenging thing to quantify. So hopefully going into winter with more normal soil moisture levels will help the skill on those forecasts. I couldn't comment directly on, exactly what adjustments may have been made to the volumetric forecasts themselves based on that. I do know all of our forecasters coordinate closely with the National Weather Service river forecast centers to, and take a look at their soil moisture model, our in situ soil moisture data at SNOTEL sites. And they will make adjustments depending on situations there, but I'd have to speak with the folks actually running those models. But definitely encouraging, again, from a water supply standpoint, that we did enter winter with very plentiful soil moisture levels in a general sense. But that also can affect the rate of snow melt transitioning to stream flow, which is something to keep an eye on from a flood standpoint, which I know, Kevin, is the lens you're looking through. So there is certainly, with those higher soil moisture values, the possibility for a more rapid transition of snow melt into the river channels.
Carl, your runoff forecasting maps there, are those prepared, are those updated daily, or are those just prepared on the first of the month?
So anything on the map is just first of the month.
Okay,
And then those time series graphs that I was showing that show the change, those are updated daily. Though I don't think they updated since the 23rd. So maybe they are on a slower routine, but I believe they are supposed to update daily. And again, always bear in mind, those are just automated and using SNOTEL only, as opposed to including snow course data, which is why we see the differences from our official ones. But they are a great resource to at least keep an eye on general trends of how things are shifting week to week.
of course. And I guess the one that really caught my eye was down in the Southwest Basin, where I know I was looking at the basin as a whole, but I think it showed a forecast value for runoff of 124% or something like that. And that seemed awfully low to where we're sitting at, but I'm guessing based on the answer you just gave that it probably doesn't factor in the March precipitation that we've received so far.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, these are from March 1st data that you can see here. So we're anticipating that to change really quite a bit. So that's this, everything on the map is our first of month data. And then here again, we have our guidance forecasts where you can really see all of these traces of the different exceedance probabilities increasing very, very significantly. Almost, you can tell based on the traces, this 50% chance of exceedance getting up to almost where the 90th, or at least a little above where the 30% chance of exceedance was. So yeah, across the Southwest basins, we really are anticipating those next official forecasts to be substantially higher.
Okay, and if I can ask one more question, I'm sorry to pepper you here, but I made some notes during your presentation to try to pinpoint areas that I'm going to kind of flag as areas to watch. And I'm wondering if I could get your reaction on these, and if any of these maybe aren't necessary, and if I'm missing any as well. So I wrote down the North Fork of the Gunnison, the Uncompahgre River, the Grand Mesa, the entire Southwest Basin, especially the Dolores, and then the Yampa River and the Little Snake. Just based on your interpretation of the graphs, did I miss anything that you think is not only elevated, but particularly elevated this year?
Those are the ones that would jump out to me as well. Certainly, all of the Southwest Basin, North Fork of the Gunnison, I think is well worth keeping a close eye on. Particularly because a lot of that snowpack on the Grand Mesa isn't especially high elevation. It's a lot of snow across, at least from our SNOTEL monitoring standpoint, mid elevations, I would say. So, there's a lot of snow up there, and I could anticipate it melting relatively quickly, as opposed to a region where there's a lot more elevation difference. The higher elevations are going to melt out a lot slower. But yeah, the North Fork of the Gunnison has a lot of snow covered area in the mid to low elevations that I think could impact melt rates when that does start to happen. Yeah, certainly the Yampa, Little Snake. Those are definitely a lot of I think your list you put together there are some of the ones that I had in my head too. But yeah, all of the Southwest basins. Forecasts for the Uncompahgre maybe aren't quite as dramatic, but something to keep an eye on, and especially with that one site on the plateau being it's completely blown away. It's all-time record high. So the Uncompahgre Plateau doesn't have the most high elevation, but similar to the Grand Mesa, it covers a ton of land area that is gonna melt off. So I think the Uncompahgre is worth watching as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Carl. Any other questions for Carl? Looks like there is one in the chat here from Russ.
Not a high priority. Not worth taking meeting time for. More curiosity.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, perfect. Well, there's no other questions. Just wanted to quickly turn it over to see if any water providers had updates on reservoir storage or any drought restrictions before we moved on to the flood portion of the meeting. So just wanted to open the space up and see if anyone had updates.
Sure, this is Jordan Soldano with Denver Water. I could give a quick update. Right now, our reservoir storage is at about 81% of normal for this time of year. Or I'm sorry, 81% full, and normal for this time of year is 79% full. Sorry about that. And then our South Platte snowpack right now is about 85% of normal, and Colorado River snowpack is about 100% of normal.
Yeah, I was about to say you're dead.
So I ruined his vacation, I hear that.
Yeah.
I did.
That's a
Perfect.
fun
Thanks so
ride.
It wasn't me.
In Admiral. It
Did
was
you have other updates?
It was tragic. Let's be honest.
Nope, that's all for us.
Because he.
Okay, thank you so much, Jordan. Appreciate it. Any other updates? Just looking through the list here to see if people are unmuting. Not seeing anyone, so with that, then let's turn it over to the flood threat overview and update, and hand it over to Kevin.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. And thanks for the opportunity to hijack a portion of this meeting. Typically, we do this every year for the March meeting, just because it gives us a chance to kind of look ahead in the near future to spring runoff and the snowpack and how that might affect things. We did not have if I recall correctly anyway, we did not have the flood portion of this meeting last year for a number of reasons, not least of which is that the snowpack was very low and there probably wouldn't have been a lot to talk about other than the standard things. It's obviously a much different situation this year. And this year kind of reminds me more of something like 2011 than 2019 in the sense that if we have a bit of dichotomy in the state. I swear it never ceases to amaze me. It's only in a state like Colorado where we could be talking about record snowpack and drought at the same meeting, expanding drought even, and yet there we are. And that's what I remember from 2011, although that year was more of a north-south dichotomy as opposed to a west-east like this year. 2019 was, of course, has been thrown around in the presentation so far, and it was a very high number statewide. And I remember having the same snowpack concerns that year. And other than some isolated instances, which predictably occur any time that you have a snowpack this high, we escaped that season without major problems. And I think Russ hit on that earlier. It's something that I very much subscribe to, and partly because of his predecessor, Nolan Duskin, drilling it into me early in my career, which is that we are just blessed in this state from a flooding standpoint, in that in large part, snowpack just tends to run off in a very behaved manner. And that certainly is not the case for all Western states, not just California, but some of the others as well. So I find myself most years in this situation as when there's a little bit of heightened awareness for high snowpack to try to quell some fears and tell everybody to take a deep breath. We usually get out of things just fine. I still believe that, but I will say that I'm watching things a little more closely this year, especially in the watersheds that I just listed off. Some of those which were already on my radar before I even signed on to this meeting, and some of those that I've added to my list since listening to Carl's talk as well. For historical context, it's been almost 40 years now since we've had a presidential disaster due to snowpack flooding. I believe the last year that we had it was in 1984. It might have been 83, but it was those years that you typically think of with really high inflows, especially the Colorado River Basin. They get thrown around a lot during these dry times. So it's been a long time since it's happened. And as Russ very ably reported, it's not just the presence of snow that creates our problems. It needs to have some kind of trigger as well. And the classic trigger is the late spring sustained warm up. That's the thing that always causes me concern. What I think can cause even more damages, but is a rare instance, is when we get rain on snow as well. So those are the kind of events that we watch for also. And kind of like with rainfall flooding, which really throughout our state's history has been by far the more common issue in terms of the damages caused. Just like with that phenomenon, even as we sit here in the last week of March, I think most of us that either are in the weather business or are interested in it because of how it affects our work will all agree that just like it's impossible to predict a heavy rainstorm 2 months in the future, it's also hard to predict a 5-day warm up 2 months in the future. So all we can look at are seasonal trends, and we'll just have to keep an eye on things as they go. But I think for most of the western half of the state, the first box is checked, which is there's a lot of snow to melt. And so that certainly increases the probability and is why that we need to keep an eye on things. The other thing I'll just mention in terms of flood threat before I start running through our agenda here, what has been a much more practical problem during the last few years, and I think will remain a problem in the state for the foreseeable future, is also the impacts of wildfire and what we see following that. It's been particularly problematic because you just don't know where wildfire is going to happen next. And so when it does happen, suddenly you're faced with this enormous increase in flood risk that didn't exist prior to the fire. And it's sometimes a difficult pill for local residents to swallow, that increased risk will last not only through the rest of that summer, but can last 3, sometimes 5 or more years into the future. So we've got a number of wildfire scars that we need to continue to watch in the state. Probably the ones that are biggest on our minds are going to be the ones from the fall of 2020. It's been less than 3 years since those wildfires occurred. They were enormous in size, some of them very, very high in intensity as well. And so while we would expect the risk of flooding and debris flows to decrease a little bit more with every passing year, I think it's fair to say that most of the 2020 burn scars are still not out of the enhanced risk. And we've had lots of problems with many of those last year. And I expect perhaps with a little bit of reduction, we're going to see the same problem again this year. Fortunately, it does look like the outlook for wildfires is greatly reduced this year compared to previous years, with 2020 through 2022 in mind. We of course had the big wildfires in the fall of 2020, very late in the season. I am still shocked we didn't have big wildfire years either of the last 2 years, but we didn't, and things look better for this year. So maybe that will allow us to get back on a little bit more stable path. Other than those two, it's just the standard reminder that the biggest problems we typically have in this state are due to rainfall-induced floods. Impossible to predict more than at most probably a week or two in advance. But why continued floodplain management throughout the state continues to be important. You just never know where the next flood is going to occur. It can occur in the middle of a drought. It can occur when there's lots of snow in the mountains. So just important for all of our local communities to keep the flood threat in mind. That's kind of my overview. Does anybody have any questions for me before I start running down through the agenda? And I guess hearing none, the first presenter I would like to call up is going to be Chris Sturm on my staff, who is going to talk about a great program that has been developed recently. And I don't want to steal all of his thunder, but it's called Wildfire Ready Watersheds. And it's really our effort to attempt to break away from this constant pattern of responding to and recovering from wildfires, which has really consumed a great part of our efforts in the flood section, really since probably 2012 or 2013 is when I think it started. Try to break away from this response and recovery type of framework to more of a mitigation framework. We never can say where the next fire is going to occur, but this is going to be our effort to attempt to address these fires before they happen. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Kevin, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to briefly talk you through the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. I think a lot of folks on this call have probably already heard this presentation, but I do have some new slides for you. Just as a reminder, for those that have seen the presentation, this was legislated through Senate Bill 21240 in the 2021 legislative session. And the CWCB was tasked with assessing the susceptibility of our water resources and communities and our infrastructure to post-wildfire impacts. So I'm going to have a little bit of information about what we came up with as far as the statewide susceptibility analysis. When we looked at the bill, we thought we could do a little bit more and hopefully make it actionable. So we also built a framework for communities so that they could do the same type of susceptibility analysis, but in much greater detail. And the idea is that they do that and identify mitigation actions before the wildfires occur. So this is what we did at a statewide scale. We looked at values at risk across the state. We used statewide data sets for aquatic ecosystems. We got some information from Colorado Parks and Wildlife for that. We looked at reservoirs and dams and municipal water intakes, our ag water infrastructure, road crossings, and life of property. And we looked at this at the HUC 12 level, which is a small watershed size, about 10 to 40,000 acres in size. And where we had the presence of these value at risk overlaid with where we would expect to see post-wildfire hazards, that showed us our susceptibility. And we used some data sets for the hazards at the statewide level. We used the revised universal soil loss equation to develop a layer for hill slope erosion, used some USGS regression models to build a debris flow layer statewide, and looked at flooding statewide by building a hydrologic model that looked at pre-fire and post-fire conditions statewide. And I think we use 500-year floodplains as a proxy for erosion and sedimentation, or what we call the fluvial hazard zone. The state and those different data sets served as a proxy for water quality degradation. So here are the results, statewide results. Probably not a big surprise to folks to see where we are susceptible. And what you're looking at here is all the HUC 12s in the state. There's roughly 4,500 of those. And in those HUC 12s that are yellow to red, we just have a much higher presence of values at risk and post-wildfire hazards. We could have a lot of values at risk on our eastern plains. We generally don't see post-wildfire hazards related to erosion and debris flows or massive changes to hydrology out there. Here's another look at the same data, but by county. So we can see our counties that are greatest risk. So the western 3/5 of the state here, we've got a lot of potential for post-wildfire hazards, and therefore we're susceptible. If you guys want to check this out, I have a link at the end to our website, but it's wildfirereadywatersheds.com. We have hard copies of the maps there that you can check out. We did one for overall susceptibility. We did another for just water infrastructure, and then another for life and property. But we also have this Explorer on the website where users can look at different data. Here I've got the reservoir layer turned on with the post-wildfire hazard of debris flows. So I encourage folks to check that out and play around with the data a little bit. The real meat of the program, though, is the local framework for local communities to implement. We're calling it the Wildfire Ready Action Plan, or the WRAP. We developed a template scope of work for that. We also have a grant program that was funded through legislation last year. There's $10 million in that program, and links towards the end of the presentation here where you guys could check that out. But we really want folks that are in those highly susceptible areas to start developing their own wildfire ready action plans. And just a quick look of, quick picture of what that looks like here. There's different tasks around the social aspect, the visioning, and putting your stakeholder groups together. But the real meat of the work is assembling the data, the value at risk data and the post-wildfire hazard data, and then doing some modeling and analysis to identify that susceptibility at the local level. And then finally, it's not a wrap, it's not an action plan until we identify what those actions are. And out of these plans, we're expecting to see mitigation actions that make sense to implement before fire and those that make more sense to implement after fire. We also have a lot of fact sheets to support this template scope of work, and they're linked through there. The Quick Start Guide is a wonderful place to start, but for those that aren't as technically savvy as most of the folks on this call, we've got a lot of different fact sheets about the different values at risk and more importantly, the hazards. So just want to let everybody know this was built upon experience. We have a lot of experience dealing with fires after the fact. It's a tough time to innovate, and it's a really tough time to get things done. People are confused about who should be doing the modeling and what type of modeling, what level of detail do we need. So this is just a quick example of what we did after the East Troublesome Fire. We did a really coarse scale hydrologic and hydraulic model, and then asked the stakeholders, asked Grand County and the Northern Water Conservancy District for their data for their values at risk. And so we're looking at structure data here, but also water infrastructure data. And when we overlaid that with our model, we came up with these hotspot areas. These are areas that are at significant risk for post-wildfire flooding or debris flows or erosion or all those things together. And this helped the NRCS identify areas that they should focus their emergency watershed protection program on. So what we're doing through the Wildfire Ready Action Plan is encouraging communities to go through this analysis before they have a fire. And that way they can come up with strategies to implement that also enhance ecological function, protect our water supplies, and make our watersheds overall more resilient, able to respond to and recover from disturbances. And so Dr. Ellen Wohl out of Colorado State University shared some information with me that I've adapted here of just one example of what we might implement in advance of a fire. She's come up with this term beads, where we have depositional areas that naturally slow the flow in our watersheds and hold sediment, wood and carbon. These are usually wet meadow areas where the channel is multiple threads of the channel are well connected with the floodplain. And historically, we had a lot of these areas. Today, we don't have many. I don't think we'll ever get back to where we were historically for a lot of different reasons, but if we can start strategizing where to restore these areas so they make us more resilient from post-wildfire flooding, we think that's a good strategy. The CWCB has supported this through this type of activity through our watershed restoration program, which has now been condensed with our water plan grants for watershed health and recreation. And what you're looking at here on the left and right is a Trail Creek project in Upper Gunnison, a wet meadow restoration project. We do a lot of different restoration projects, but down here in the middle of the screen, there's an alluvial fan restoration project there that was done after the Waldo Canyon fire to help slow the flow and drop sediment out to protect our downstream values at risk. So these bead areas, they naturally occur on the landscape, and in some instances, they're really good during fire to serve as fire breaks, and certainly enhance a lot of different objectives, including our enhance and protect our ecosystems, but also protect our water supplies. And so we think it's a good strategy for a lot of reasons, but especially as we get prepared for post-wildfire hazards. Now, some mitigation activities that I didn't mention that we're encouraging through that RAP analysis might also be the development of a scope of work for an early warning system. We have a template for that. We can't protect everything with structural improvements. We're also asking water suppliers to think about water supply redundancy in this type of plan. So there's a variety of different mitigation strategies that are built into that scope of work. Here's the website. I really encourage everyone to have a look at this. You can see on the top row here, we don't have a whole lot of tabs to get through. In the resources tab, those that are interested in the type of data we use, you can find more information about this. In the action plan tab, if you scroll down a little bit, there are direct links to the CWCB's grant program that supports implementation of the RAP. Also say quickly that we're able to fund up to 75% of the implementation for those studies. And then we've got the statewide analysis here. So that was real quick, but I think I only had about 10 minutes. So I'll just take questions if we have them, or we'll go to the next speaker.
Anybody have any questions for Chris?
Hi, this is Kaylee Folk from Grand County. I just want to commend Chris and his team and Steve for the work that you guys have done to put together this program. Grand County, as you know, is submitting an application for the grant, and you've just really made the process really easy for us to get things going. So just want to thank you, and we're really excited to get this going.
Wonderful. You're welcome, Kaylee. Thanks for bringing that up.
Well, thanks, Chris, for your presentation, and thanks for all of the hard work you and your folks have put into this program. As you well know, we're not foresters, we are natural resource managers and public safety officials, but wildfires don't just create problems for foresters, they create problems for us as well. And I think this program is going to go a long way to hopefully changing around the paradigm as to how our agency and folks in our world work with wildfires. So thank you. All right, moving on. I'd like to kind of move over to a similar topic, which is be the first time we've brought this towards the flood task force here. It's not just wildfires that change flooding characteristics for areas of the state. We also can experience quite a bit of issues with erosion and sedimentation and stream migration. And you know, there's a number of rivers in the state that are just naturally prone to this kind of activity. But I'll also draw your attention as an example to the 2013 floods, which to this day are still the costliest natural disaster that the state of Colorado has ever had of any kind. And one of the biggest problems that we faced during that event was not just how high the water got, and it did get high, But because of the nature of the flows and the fact that they remained elevated for so long, you may recall that the catalyst for that flood was actually a multi-day storm that had tropical influences from the Gulf of Mexico. But it resulted in just an incredible amount of stream movement, particularly in urban areas of northern Colorado as well as El Paso County. And it just showed that, unfortunately, the National Flood Insurance Program, as well as a lot of local floodplain regulations, they're very, very good at addressing static flooding conditions that can be modeled and predicted. Where I think they fall a little bit short is in areas where streams migrate and they move and the flooding characteristics change either quickly or maybe a little bit over time. So as a result, our section has worked on what we call a fluvial hazard zone protocol to attempt to study this phenomenon as well as come up with actions to address it. And I'd like to invite Andrea Harbin Monahan on my staff to provide a quick report on the fluvial hazard zone and what some of the most recent updates are. So Andrea, I'll turn it over to you.
Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you fine, Andrea, but you had your presentation queued up and now it's disappeared.
Yeah, I got booted for a sec. So
Okay, there we go.
sorry, unstable internet connection and whatnot. Thanks, Kevin. So the fluvial hazard zone update, for those of you that don't know, the fluvial hazard zone is the area that we describe as a stream as having occupied, that it may occupy or that it may physically influence as the stream transports water, sediment, and debris. And the objective of this mapping is to identify areas that are vulnerable to fluvial geomorphic hazards, to characterize those hazards, and to reduce the risk to life and property through increased awareness and mitigation. And like Kevin mentioned, this program was born out of the 2013 floods, where we found that more than half of all flood insurance claims came from outside of the 100-year floodplain. And so this mapping is meant to better capture what the existing risk is and to create a more complete understanding of river-related hazards. So we map this by identifying the active stream corridor and the fluvial hazard buffer among some other geomorphic features, and identifying areas that can accommodate erosion and deposition. And once we know where these areas exist, we can provide more accurate assessments of flood hazards. We can provide more defensible delineations for site development and land use planning, and we can avoid the fluvial hazard zone when repairing and or replacing infrastructure. And we can also provide space for erosion and sediment deposition after wildfire, among many other benefits. So we have a few tools to encourage this mapping. One is through the stream management planning. We have a few stream management plans that are either recently completed or currently underway that do include fluvial hazard zone mapping as a task in their planning efforts, where this mapping is used to prioritize projects where stream and wetland restoration may improve floodplain connectivity and flow. So for example, we have the Upper Arkansas Resiliency Plan, which is using fluvial hazard zone mapping to revisit and revise land use codes. So for site development and land use. And then we also have the Yampa River Integrated Water Management Plan, which recently wrapped up. And they use fluvial hazard zone mapping to recommend agricultural use within the fluvial hazard zone. They've recommended things like exploring stream corridor easements, and they have a number of riparian restoration projects that have been recommended, and all informed through fluvial hazard zone mapping. And then also this mapping is an important component of the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program that Chris was talking about, where we can use it to identify areas of erosion and deposition, those beads that Chris was talking about. So places that can dissipate flow post-fire. So once we know where those areas are located, we can work to reconnect the river to its floodplain if that's necessary, so that the system can effectively work to store sediment and dissipate energy. Or if there are areas that are already functioning well in that way, then we can take action to preserve them. And so we can also use this information to address things like bank stability. We could potentially relocate or retrofit infrastructure. There's many actions that we could take that could make the active stream corridor more resilient and just better protect life and property in the event of a large flood event or a post-fire debris flow. So that's all I have. It's a brief update, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Anybody have any questions for Andrea? All right, Andrea, I guess you get off easy here. Thanks for your update and thanks for all your work on this. I think this is important work and definitely addresses a threat that I think has not gotten adequate attention in the past. So thank you again.
Thanks.
Okay, up next, I would like to invite Marta Blanco Castaño from my staff to talk about some of what's been going on lately with our floodplain identification. So we've talked a little bit about special hazards with the wildfires and the fluvial hazard zones. Now I want to get back into just a little bit more traditional floodplain identification. And then Marta will, after she talks about that, will also discuss her efforts in developing a statewide LIDAR layer and where that is at and how you can obtain some of that. So Marta, if you are on, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Sorry again, I missed actually most of this meeting. I'm concurrently taking a training. Of course, timing never works out. But yeah, I'm glad I was able to join. So I'll give a little bit of an update on our recent efforts and kind of what the floodplain mapping program is doing here at CWCB. So a couple of things I'd like to start with is that we are avidly working on producing better information regarding two-dimensional modeling and kind of pros and cons between the traditional one-dimensional modeling versus kind of what the trend is moving towards, which is that two-dimensional modeling, which many times provides better information and can be more powerful, representing conditions at the in areas of like heavily braided streams, for example, or flatter terrain. So it's something that definitely benefits our communities. However, as most of you may know, there are difficulties in managing to those more complicated data sets, especially since they're newer. The guidance is kind of a little bit behind to help communities, again, regulate to it and conduct floodplain management at the local level. So it's something that we're working to create more trainings and brochures, informational pieces, et cetera, and work with our communities because a lot of them just don't have the manpower or the technical ability or, training or background or, a lot of our communities, the local librarian is also the town clerk, is also the floodplain manager, is also managing a very complicated levee system. So we're doing our best to work with communities, and I wanted to maybe show a couple examples of kind of what we're generating. Let me see, I think. Let me know if you guys see a PDF that says Colorado Flood Risk Study Types.
Yep, and we can see that on the screen, Marta.
Great. So this is just an example of, a brochure we've produced fairly recently. This is particularly used in our phase 2 study. So however familiar you're with flood risk studies, there are 4 main phases. The first one is the base level engineering, where we generate zone A ready floodplains just to kind of give an idea for what the risk may, or hazard, not risk quite yet, but the hazard may look like at the local level. And then maybe highlight areas of potential future projects, mitigation projects and resilience building and that kind of thing, as well as provide, of course, model-backed, information that a lot of communities may not have had if they're just on paper maps that were, generated like in the 70s and 80s and may not have had, again, that model backing. So that's our first phase. Second phase is data development, detailed data development. So we go through survey collection, incorporation of generation of hydrology, hydraulics, floodplain mapping, etc. So that gets more into the nitty gritty of what the regulatory side of things requires. Phase 3 is going to be more of the hitting preliminary and the due process aspect. And then phase 4 is kind of just like the post preliminary and letter of final determination, incorporating maps into or adopting maps into regulatory ordinances and codes. But so at the phase 2 is when we're asking communities to help us determine the detailed study reaches for the scope of work so that we can budget accordingly and get them something that's going to help them at the local level. Of course, anything that's currently effective will have to be restudied, but they can always upgrade. If, for example, they had a Zone A study before and they want to get more detail, they want to get those BFEs, base flood elevations. So we're creating these types of documents that are both visually appealing and can kind of give them an example of like the differences on the visual. You know, you can kind of see the base level engineering on the left here just has kind of like a generalized floodplain, not a lot of information, no cross sections, no base flood elevations. It's just a generalized floodplain map depicting potential risk, primarily hazard. Whereas the enhanced level study here has more detail, has the floodway, has elevations on the water surface here. Then we go into, okay, now between one-dimensional modeling and two-dimensional modeling, what are the key differences and how could this help your community? This is a little bit text heavy. If anybody's interested, we can definitely share this, but then we kind of give some recommendations. We kind of go into explaining the floodway and how that differs between, again, a one-dimensional versus two-dimensional model. Some considerations and questions, FAQs that community officials may have when determining what to choose and how to finalize that scope of work with us. So anyway, we're trying to create some of these guidance documents. I'll also share the website here. So you may be familiar with our coloradohazardmapping.com website. We have been creating additional tabs and resources here. I'll go a little bit into the lighter here, but fluvial hazard mapping is going to actually direct to Andrea's and Chris's and Steve's work, whereas the floodplain management, some training resources are going to be more geared. And we're working on this, so it's not quite completed yet, but we're working on spelling out a little bit more clearly for the local floodplain administrators, different responsibilities, what resources they may have, you know, just additional informational pieces that they may be able to tap into. So there are different tabs here, and some of these videos, of course, are coming soon. But there are some general trainings that we've already uploaded. You just have to peruse through a lot of these tabs to get to them. That may offer really helpful insight or kind of, more information on, post-wildfire flood risks and how that changes whenever the land is hydrophobic, etc. So yeah, we're working to create a lot of these resources for the everyday floodplain administrator, but also for other stakeholders that may be involved in the flood risk mapping, flood risk regeneration side of things. We are also working on a model download page so that instead of struggling through contacting FEMA library folks and getting models for when you're working, especially in like conditional letters of map revision or letters of map revision, you can just come here. And if you know that there's an active study, effective ones too that have already happened, for example, this one in Rio Blanco County, and others maybe around the South Platte, you can come here and dig through it and it'll be much easier. So we're actively working on posting a lot of these. So please bear with us as we continue to work with our developers and collect information, but we are hoping to enhance a lot of these resources. Training resources, again, we're putting together some videos. There was one that we did recently on different survey characteristics for communities. So particularly related to flood risk studies and the risk mapping assessment and planning program. So the larger National Flood Insurance Program considerations. A lot of times when surveyors are in the field and in communities and they're collecting information for, say, an elevation certificate so that a property can apply for a letter of map amendment, a LOMA, and be removed from the floodplain because maybe they've built above the base flood elevation. There's a lot of confusion and maybe some of the local surveyors may not be fully aware of how they're supposed to gather this information or why it's important for the larger NFIP program to make sure communities aren't hit with violations and other such issues. So we conducted a training in Chaffee County, and we thought that was really helpful. A lot of people had questions. We had really good discussions. So we're working on putting together some of these things. A lot of times we kindly request that communities and stakeholders actually tell us what they'd want to hear about so that we can work with our contractors and our funding to put together those trainings for you all. So again, just always do reach out with suggestions, with comments, with requests. That's kind of how we know that we're producing things that are helpful for others, because you're telling us what you want to see. Let me see what else I want to talk about. I guess we can go briefly into the LiDAR. I don't want to take a ton of time. I know I talk a lot sometimes. So LiDAR, good news is we're finally at statewide coverage. So recently the Northwest Colorado acquisition that covered a lot of the some of the areas here with the Cameron Peak Fire and some others out kind of in this area. It's kind of hard to see with so many acquisitions overlapping with each other. But if you see here, it'll say 2020 Northwest. There are several blocks. So there's block
Hey,
one.
Marta, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
I don't think we're seeing what I think you want us to see here. Still
Oh.
on the risk map page.
Let me stop sharing and reshare. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. Do you guys see the LiDAR page now?
Yes, that looks right.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Well, now I'm wondering how much I've been sharing that you guys missed. But anyway, I can quickly go back if folks missed it. But yeah. So anyway, the Northwest Colorado acquisition is now available. We're working to upload some of the latest data sets. I believe the DMs are on there, and we're just working to upload the LAS point cloud files and some of the metadata. The only thing that we're still missing, and this was something that this town of Aspen did not agree to and doesn't seem to want to agree to in the future, is their little jurisdictional LiDAR coverage. That's the only thing in the entire state of Colorado that now is unavailable. But I do believe they do have local data sets. You may just have to go through them if you're interested in this particular area. I'm not entirely sure of the history behind that, but it's just the one thing that's not available for the statewide coverage. Everything else now we have. Of course, in the future, as we work towards acquiring additional LiDAR for areas, we'll be sure to communicate that. I know there have been requests from other parties and stakeholders to update some of the data sets that are now getting a little bit older, especially out here. There's some stuff from 2016 and 2015 here in like Central West Colorado. So I'm sure we will eventually acquire updates for those areas. And again, just to quickly summarize in case this was missed before, our coloradohazardmapping.com website, we're creating new resources here for training, floodplain management, and the model download, which again, you can come here. It's not complete yet. We're working on it. We just started on this very recently. But once this loads, there will be some links to certain models that are either preliminary or effective so that you don't have to deal with paying the FEMA library folks for it if it's something that we already have that we worked on fairly recently. I'm not sure if anybody has questions or if I missed any other major topic that might be of interest.
Does anybody have any questions for Marta?
Or Terry. You guys might know Terry Fade is my program manager, and she's deep in the Lomer side of things most of the time, which keeps her quite busy. We have a lot of requests throughout the state, and we're working as expeditiously as we can, but there's a lot going on. So please be patient with us if you have questions or requests.
Okay, well, if there are no questions, I will bring us to the last item on the agenda before we wrap up. And we are 30 minutes ahead of time, but I still want to thank everybody for hanging with us. I know this is a long meeting with a long agenda, but appreciate everybody's involvement here. For the last person on the agenda, I'd like to invite Doug Mahan to join. Doug serves as our state floodplain manager. And so therefore, manages floodplain regulations on behalf of the state, although in almost all cases, the regulations themselves are actually implemented at the local level. So I asked Doug to just give us a brief update on what's going on with the regulations side of the National Flood Insurance Program, and I'll let you take it away, Doug.
Great. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I'll give a brief overview of what the National Flood Insurance Program is for those that may be unfamiliar with it, and as a refresher for our veterans. Some current statistics, and then some focuses of the program. So the National Flood Insurance Program was created in 1968 following the passage of the National Flood Insurance Act. It's a federal program. It's administered by FEMA. The 1968 National Flood Insurance Act was passed because of a lack of private flood insurance availability for the citizens of the United States. Its goal, one of the goals, is to reduce federal disaster assistance that had been increasing in the decades prior. And the program itself is focused on life safety, property protection, and community resilience. So it's a voluntary program. Communities must adopt and enforce floodplain development management rules. Once they do that, they become eligible for federally backed flood insurance policies for all of their residents, and not just the residents that are in the special flood hazard areas. And it makes additional federal flood disaster and mitigation funding available. There are 4 components to the National Flood Insurance Program. The first one, as Marta covered, is flood hazard mapping. This identifies the potential flood risk, and it also determines the areas of mandatory flood insurance purchasing. The other components are flood insurance. This is NFIP insurance. It's typically more affordable than private flood insurance. And the NFIP insurance is guaranteed to be available for all residents in a community, unlike some private insurance, which can pick and choose who to cover. Another component is the mitigation grants. This are flood prevention measures. It's proactive protection of life and property. And then floodplain management itself. This is discouraging development in the floodplain and to ensure that development that does occur complies with the rules and are reasonably safe from flooding. Currently, there are 256 Colorado communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. There are 17 Colorado communities with identified regulatory floodplains that do not participate. And the towns of Hugo and Silver Cliff are 2 communities that are actively pursuing participation at this time. As Carl and Kevin pointed out during their presentations, increased runoff forecast for the burn scars also increased potential flood risk. So from the 2020 wildfires here in Colorado, the Cameron Peak, the East Troublesome, Callwood, and Left Hand Canyon, and the Grizzly Creek fires, all of those burn scars present an ongoing hazard for the residents in those scars and downstream. We have seen flash flooding over the last couple of years. In 2021, we saw 4 people killed in the Black Hollow flash flood. 2022, just this past summer, we had 2 people killed in the Buckhorn Canyon flash flood. And then the I-70 closures resulting from the Grizzly Creek fire near the Glenwood Springs Canyon. Those have all been incidents in the last couple of years resulting from these wildfires and their burn scars. One of the focuses of my office is to increase risk awareness for these communities and for their residents and visitors. One of the changes that we are seeing at a federal level is FEMA has rolled out the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard. This is a program that looks to introduce higher standards for federally funded structures and projects in the special flood hazard area. This is also applicable to those communities and organizations receiving grants and loans from the federal government for projects in the special flood hazard area. Adoption of flood protection standards higher than the NFIP minimum is their goal. To give you an example, recently the Housing and Urban Development Department of the federal government has proposed new rules for their funded structures. It includes an increase in freeboard up to 2 feet or more, requirement for additional flood insurance above what is currently required, and removing letter of map changes. These are the letters of map revision and letters of map amendment. Removing those products from exceptions for flood insurance or for requiring to build to a flood development management standard. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Hey, does anybody have any questions, comments for Doug? Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the agenda. Thank you, Doug, for that update. I'd say at this point, I'd just like to wrap up the flood section of the meeting. Just a couple last comments that I have, and if anybody wants to comment on anything you either heard during the agenda, or if you just want to talk about the snowpack situation in general and how that could impact flood risks, I'd be happy to continue that conversation. I just want to remind everybody of the power of forecasting. So we've got the multiple river basin forecast centers that will be doing updated forecasts for the river basins as time goes on. That's a very good location to look for updated forecasts on spring runoff. Of course, the National Weather Service provides watches and warnings as well. Pay close attention to their warnings, which means that flooding is either expected or imminent. I would also like to mention that soon our daily flood threat bulletin that is prepared by a contractor for the Colorado Water Conservation Board will be starting up. And this is intended to complement the National Weather Service's forecasting program as well. It provides a daily assessment of flood issues that may be seen throughout the state. This is prepared for the CWCB by Dewberry Engineering, and I'd like to find out if David Sutley is on the call right here.
I am, Kevin.
Okay. I didn't ask David to prepare a full presentation. They've done it during past meetings, and I think if you've attended these flood meetings in the past, you've probably seen it. But there are some changes this year that are going to be taking place to the program, and I just asked David to say a few words about that.
Hey, thanks, Kevin, and appreciate the opportunity to be on today. I'd say the biggest announcements that us as the provider of the flood threat bulletin to CWCB wanted to kind of make the group aware of that are going to be new for this season would primarily be the way that the information is actually disseminated. We are going to be doing a major website overhaul, and that's why if you do try to go to coloradofloodthreat.com, it's not going to let you go there right now because we are currently deploying a new website, and we're getting out of the more limited functionality WordPress environment and going into a custom web application to allow a user to get more information in a dashboard style tiled format that it will allow top line information up front quite a bit more rapidly. And we'll be have a website up and running this in April prior to our season starting on May 1st. We're excited about that. Again, our season runs from May 1st through the end of September every year for forecast operations. And our three primary products again include the daily flood threat assessment and provide flood threat polygons across the state. And one big key functionality that we're going to be providing this year on the new website would be the ability to go back and look at previous archives of flood threats more easily by using a calendar select instead of the blog post format. So that'll be a big upgrade this year. And we're also going to be continuing to provide our fire burn forecast analysis as well. And then which will be based on currently we have the same fire burn areas 11 that we were operating on last season. We are doing some analysis to see, and we'll be coordinating with CWCB on if any of those burn areas do need to be removed based on the really likelihood of a threat being generated over those areas. And then lastly is really kind of our 24 to 72 hour look back, what we call the state precipitation map. And that kind of encompasses the previous day's flood reports, any conditions as they actually occurred, and a kind of a narrative around that. And we're really going to be pulling in a lot more data in an automated way so a user can see specific flood reports, specific debris flows that have occurred in the previous days, how kind of pulling in a feed of the flood reports and river stages as reported by the river forecast centers as well, and to kind of a very consolidated and easy to digest format. So those are kind of the primary updates I wanted to provide to the group today. And again, stay tuned. We'll be providing updates to our subscriber list when the website's up and running prior to May 1st. And we're excited to kick off a new season here. I guess any questions for me or Kevin on the Flood Threat Bulletin program?
So there's a question, what will the new link be?
It'll be the same.
Yeah.
It'll be the same exact website link.
And just to remind everybody, that's coloradofloodthreat.com. And we should be starting our services on May 1st. Okay, well, unless there are any other questions for David, I think at that point, I'm ready to wrap up the flood section of this meeting. Again, I will say that you've probably gotten the message loud and clear that there's a lot of snow in various areas of the mountains this year. And I think as when we transition from accumulation season to runoff season, the key things we're going to have to look for in terms of flood potential will be either a rapid sustained warm up early on during the runoff season or a rain on snow event. Impossible to predict at this time, as I said, but those will be the kind of events that we're looking for. Otherwise, it looks to be a good runoff year for water managers. And I think a lot of us on the call that are wearing that kind of hat are probably very happy this year. So Sam, I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks everybody for your attention and participation.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you to all the presenters today. I don't have much to add here at the end, so appreciate all you who lasted till the end here. And I guess we'll conclude today's meeting. Thanks so much and look forward to seeing you all next month. The next meeting is coming up on April 20th, and that is a Thursday, so we'll see you all then. Thanks so much. Have a great day.